approximately Earth. It was March 10th in the year 1876 that the first discernible speech is transmitted over a telephone system when inventor Alexander Graham Bell summons his assistant in another room by saying, quote, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you," unquote. Bell had received a comprehensive telephone patent just 3 days before. Alexander Graham Bell, born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1847, was the son of Alexander Melville Bell, a leading authority in public speaking and speech correction. The young Bell was trained to take over the family business, and while still a teenager, he became a voice teacher and began to experiment in sound. In 1870, his family moved to Ontario, Canada, and in 1871, Bell went to Boston to demonstrate his father's method of teaching speech to the deaf. The next year, he opened his own school in Boston for training teachers of the deaf, and in 1873 became professor of vocal physiology at Boston University. In his free time, Bell experimented with sound waves and became convinced that it would be possible to transmit speech over a telegraph-like system. He enlisted the aid of a gifted mechanic, Thomas Watson, and together the two spent countless nights trying to convert Bell's idea into practical form. In 1875, while working on his multiple harmonic telegraph, Bell developed the basic ideas for the telephone. He designed a device to transmit speech vibrations electrically between two receivers, and in June of 1875 tested his invention. No intelligible words were transmitted, but sounds resembling human speech were heard at the receiving end. On February 14th in 1876, he filed a U.S. patent application for his telephone. Just a few hours later, another American inventor, Elisha Gray, filed a caveat with U.S. Patent Office about his intent to seek a similar patent on a telephone transmitter and receiver. Bell filed first, so on March 7th, he was awarded U.S. Patent 100,074,465, which granted him ownership over both his telephone instruments and the concept of a telephone system. 3 days later, on March 10th, Bell successfully tested his telephone for the first time in his Boston home. In May, he publicly demonstrated the invention before the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston, and in June at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. In October, he successfully tested his telephone over a 2-mile distance between Boston and Cambridgeport. Alexander Graham Bell continued his experiments in communication, inventing the photophone, which transmitted speech by light rays, and the graphophone, which recorded sound. He continued to work with the deaf, including the educator Helen Keller, and used the royalties from his inventions to finance several organizations dedicated to the oral education of the deaf. He later served as president of the National Geographic Society. Beginning in 1895, he experimented with the possibility of flight and built giant man-carrying kites and a hydrofoil craft. He continued his eternity in 1922 at his summer home and laboratory on Cape Breton Island, Canada. It was March 10th in the year 1917 that Turkish troops began an evacuation of Baghdad. Less than 2 weeks after their victorious recapture of the strategically placed city of Kut al-Amara on the Tigris River in Mesopotamia, British troops under the regional command of Sir Frederick Stanley Maude bear down on Baghdad, causing their Turkish opponents to begin a full-scale evacuation of the city on the evening of March 10th in 1917. Shortly after receiving control of regional operations in Mesopotamia in the summer of 1916, Maude began to recognize and resupply his troops in preparation for a renewed offensive. The central target of the operation would be the city of Kut, which had been captured by the Turks in April of 1916, along with 10,000 British and Indian soldiers under the command of Sir Charles Townshend, a devastating defeat for Allied operations in the region. In January of 1917, Maude's 150,000 troops set out from the regional command headquarters at Barsa, located south of Kut near the junction of the Tigris with the Euphrates River, launching the offensive that would culminate in the recapture of Kut on February 24th. In the wake of their successive cut, Ma's forces paused briefly while waiting for confirmation from headquarters in London to continue their offensive. Operations were not renewed until March 5th. A pause that gave Turkish Commander-in-Chief Khalil Pasha some time to consider his options for mounting a defense of Baghdad, the capital of the Ottoman Empire's southern region. In the end, Pasha was indecisive. After first beginning preparations for an offensively minded forward assault on approaching Allied forces, he decided instead to fall back and concentrate his troops near Baghdad itself. He therefore stationed the Turkish 6th Army some 35 miles to the south of the city near the junction of the Tigris with the Diyala River. In the absence of significant reserves, the Turks were vastly outnumbered with only 9,500 soldiers facing 45,000 British and Indian troops. Ma's troops reached the Diyala on March 8th, mounting their first assault on the Turkish positions the next morning, with Pasha and his men successfully repelled. After struggling to cross the fast-moving Diyala, Ma decided to shift his troops and cross the river at a more northern point. Alerted to the enemy's movements by German reconnaissance aircraft, Pasha mirrored his movements, sending the bulk of his forces to meet the Allied soldiers. He left a single regiment to hold the original defensive position at the Diyala, which was quickly and decisively crushed by the British and Indian forces with a sudden attack on March 10th. Stunned, Pasha ordered his troops to retreat. By the end of the day, the evacuation of Baghdad was underway. After marching more than 100 miles in 15 days, March troops entered Baghdad on March 11th without a struggle, taking 9,000 prisoners from the retreating Ottoman army amid cheers from the city's 140,000 occupants. The Allied city in Baghdad marked only the beginning of the struggle over who would control the oil-rich region of Mesopotamia, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River, now Iraq and eastern Syria. The British government had earlier promised a number of Arab leaders that their people would receive their independence if they rebelled against Turkish rule. After the Great War ended in November of 1918, however, the Treaty of Versailles and the newly created League of Nations gave Britain a mandate to govern in Mesopotamia, and the British and French governments issued a joint declaration stating their intention to work towards establishing independent Arab governments in the former Ottoman states. This was not enough, however, for the Arabs in Mesopotamia, who began an armed uprising in 1920 against British occupation forces in Baghdad and other areas. After subduing the revolt at great expense, £40 million, the British government decided to give up its mandate, drawing up a provisional government for Iraq that included a council of Arab ministers under the supervision of a British High Commissioner. In August of 1921, Faisal Hussein won 96% of the votes and was elected king of the new Iraqi nation. It was March 10th in the year 1959 that Tibetans banded together in revolt surrounding the summer palace of the Dalai Lama in defiance of Chinese occupation forces. Chinese occupation of Tibet began nearly a decade before, in October of 1950, when troops from its People's Liberation Army, or PLA, invaded the country, barely 1 year after the communists gained full control of mainland China. The Tibetan government gave in to Chinese pressure the following year, signing a treaty that ensured the power of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the country's spiritual leader, over Tibet's domestic affairs. Resistance to the Chinese occupation built steadily over the next several years, including a revolt in several areas of eastern Tibet in 1956. By December of 1958, rebellion was simmering in Lhasa, the capital, and the PLA command threatened to bomb the city if order was not maintained. The March 1959 uprising in Lhasa was triggered by fears of a plot to kidnap the Dalai Lama and take him to Beijing. When Chinese military officers invited His Holiness to visit the PLA headquarters for a theatrical performance and official tea, he was told he must come alone and that no Tibetan military bodyguards or personnel would be allowed past the edges of the military camp. On March 10th, 300,000 loyal Tibetans surrounded Nora Balinka Palace, preventing the Dalai Lama from accepting the PLA's invitation. By March 17th, Chinese artillery was aimed at the palace, and the Dalai Lama was evacuated to neighboring India. Fighting broke out in Lhasa 2 days later, with Tibetan rebels hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Early on March 21st, the Chinese began shelling Nora Balinka. continuing the eternity of thousands of men, women, and children still camped outside as a result. In the aftermath, the PLA cracked down on Tibetan resistance. Lhasa's major monasteries were destroyed. The Dalai Lama's guards, along with thousands of inhabitants of Lhasa, continued their eternity. China's stranglehold on Tibet and its brutal suppression of separatist activity has continued in the decades following the unsuccessful uprising. Tens of thousands of Tibetans followed their leader to India, where the Dalai Lama has long maintained a government in exile in the foothills of the Himalayas. The information documented on this audio file can be verified on history.com.